all. It's me, it's Dr. G, and welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. Now, they call this white gold, and it fueled a global economic revolution. It built fortunes overnight, and it turned the American South into a kingdom, the kingdom of King Cotton. But this kingdom was built on the foundation of human bodies, and the legacy of which would tear the nation apart. This week on Star-Spangled Studies, we're going to dive into one of the most consequential and contradictory periods of American history, the era of King Cotton. The story of the antebellum South is often told as one of tradition, of a region that was stuck in the past, insulated from the modernizing world. But as we will see, the South was anything but static. It was a place of explosive growth, of cutting-edge technology, and of global ambition. As our textbook puts it, the South, quote, actively engaged new technologies and trade routes and became an integral part of an increasingly global economy, end quote. But this modernizing capitalist impulse was harnessed to its most traditional and brutal of all practices, chattel slavery. This is the central paradox we'll unravel today. This revolution of cotton didn't happen by accident. It was built on three critical pillars that together transformed the South's landscape and its global economy. So let's go. The first pillar was technology. In 1794, as we talked about in a previous episode, a Massachusetts-born inventor named Eli Whitney patented a machine that would quite literally change the world, the cotton gin. Before Whitney, processing cotton was a painfully slow process. A single laborer could spend an entire day picking the sticky seeds out of just 1 pound of short staple cotton. Whitney's gin, this simple device with wired teeth that pulled fibers through slots too narrow for the seeds to go through, could clean 50 pounds or more in the same amount of time. It revolutionized cotton production. It made cotton production actually a lucrative business. This was a boon for the southern economies that were starting to turn away from tobacco into the now more lucrative cotton. It was immensely profitable, especially because short staple cotton grew really well in the Deep South. We had talked about in a previous episode how this fueled slavery's expansion in the South and the domestic slave trade from northern Old South or old states to the Deep South. The second pillar was biology. The gin was a brilliant machine, but it needed the right raw material, and that arrived in 1820 with the discovery of a new strain of cotton near Rodney, Mississippi. It was known as the Petite Gulf cotton. This was a planter's dream. The fibers were long and luxurious, but unlike other high-quality strains, it grew densely. Its bolls opened wide for easy picking, and most importantly, its seeds slid through the new cotton gins with remarkable ease. This was the biological catalyst that made the cotton revolution possible. But technology and biology were useless without the third and most foundational pillar, land. And the land for this new kingdom was acquired through a campaign of violent, state-sponsored expansion. The story of King Cotton is inseparable from the story of Indian removal. The federal government, through legislation like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which had forcibly displaced the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee nations from their ancestral homes in the Southeast. Following this ethnic cleansing, the government surveyed, divided, and auctioned off millions of acres of fertile land in what would become known as the Cotton Belt, southern Georgia, as well as Alabama, Mississippi, and northern Louisiana. This land became, quote, readily available for white men with a few dollars and big dreams, end quote. This process reveals a crucial truth often obscured in the popular narrative of the self-made planter. The rise of King Cotton was not simply a story of market forces or agricultural ingenuity. It was a deliberate, violent project underwritten by the full power of the United States government. A federal policy of Indian removal was essential for the first step of this, the precondition that cleared the way for subsequent economic booms. The wealth of King Cotton was, from its very inception, rooted in a partnership between private ambition and public violence. The transformation was astonishingly rapid. The traveler Joseph Holt Ingram, who visited Mississippi, captured the dizzying pace of the change. He recalled how, quote, "Where yesterday the wilderness darkened over the land with her wild forests, today the cotton plantations whiten the earth," end quote. Thousands rushed into the cotton belt, and with it the help of the new steam-powered riverboats to move the goods, the American South quickly became the world's leading producer of cotton. But that was all done by the labor of slaves, something we cannot forget. Millions of hands were needed to do the back-breaking work, and in antebellum America, that meant the dramatic expansion and the intensification of the single most controversial institution in the nation's history, slavery. The U.S. Constitution had banned the international slave trade starting in 1808, but this did not end slavery within the nation. Instead, it gave rise to a massive and brutal internal or domestic slave trade. This forced migration of enslaved people from the older slave states of the upper north, like Virginia and Maryland, to the new cotton lands of the deep south is often called the Second Middle Passage. It was a staggering demographic upheaval. Over 1 million enslaved African Americans were forcibly moved, marched overland in chains, or packed onto ships bound for ports like New Orleans. This journey was a second traumatic dislocation, tearing people from the communities and kinship networks that they had managed to build over generations. These statistics are chilling, and historical estimates suggest that between 1/5 and 1/3 of all slave marriages were broken up by sale or forced migration during this period. The destination for many was the slave market, a place of profound terror and dehumanization. Cities like New Orleans became the largest slave markets in North America. Their economies boomed from this trade in human flesh. To understand what the experience was like, we can turn to the powerful narrative of Solomon Northup, a free black man from New York who was kidnapped in 1841 and sold into slavery for 12 years. His account became 12 Years a Slave, and it gives us that visceral first-person view. Northup describes how potential buyers treated him and others like him. They treated him like livestock, not as people. He wrote, quote, "He would make us hold up our heads, walk briskly back and forth, while customers would feel our hands and arms and bodies, turn us about, ask us what we could do, make us open our mouths and show our teeth, precisely as a jockey examines a horse which he is about to barter for purchase." End quote. The greatest horror was the separation of families. Northup witnessed the agony of a woman named Eliza who was being sold away from her children. He recounts her desperate pleas, quote, "She besought the man not to buy her child unless he also bought herself. She promised in that case to be the most faithful slave that ever lived." End quote. Her pleas were ignored. The system's profitability depended on the ability to sever the most fundamental of human bonds. This brutal commerce was the engine of urban growth in the South. As our textbook explains, southern cities like New Orleans, Charleston, St. Louis, and Mobile, quote, doubled and even tripled in size and global importance in the antebellum decades. They became modern cosmopolitan centers with global shipping lines connecting them to Liverpool, New York, and Lisbon. They boasted theaters and universities. They had a wealthy, educated elite. But this sophistication was built directly upon the slave trade itself. The slave pens and auction houses were often located just blocks away from fine homes, mansions, and cultural institutions. The modernity of these cities was not in spite of slavery, but because of it. The very mechanisms of modern commerce, the trading firms, the warehouses, the port facilities, the financial instruments like credit and insurance, were all developed and perfected to make the buying and selling of slaves more efficient and profitable. The city was the sophisticated public face of a barbaric system, a place where the profits of human trafficking and laundering into cultural and economic capital. The barbarism and the sophistication were not just coexisting, they were symbiotic. This vast system of human trafficking, which treated people like livestock, was defended by a complex and violent culture. I cannot state that enough. To understand the mind of the enslaver, to understand how they could attend a slave auction in the morning and a church service in the afternoon, we have to explore their worldview, a world built on the violent defense of honor and a chillingly new ideology. So, for the white man of the planter class, public reputation was everything. This was a culture of honor. Honor was not an internal feeling of self-worth. It was a public performance of authority and mastery over one's dependents. This included mastery over wives, children, and most importantly, the enslaved people that they claimed as property. To have one's word questioned, to be called a liar or a coward, was to have this mastery publicly challenged. Such an insult demanded a response, often a violent one, culminating in the ritual of the duel. Dueling had largely vanished in the North, but it remained a central, if illegal, part of the Southern Honor Code. A fascinating example of this code in action is the dispute between two prominent South Carolinians, James Hammond and his brother-in-law Wade Hampton II. Hammond had engaged in sexual relationships with Hampton's 4 teenage daughters. When Hampton found out about this, he didn't immediately challenge Hammond to a duel, which was custom at the time. Instead, he tried to use it to create a scandal, trying to ruin Hammond politically. But in the eyes of their peers, this was the greater dishonor. By failing to seek immediate violent satisfaction to the dishonor imposed upon him, Hampton was seen as a coward. Hammond wrote in his diary that Hampton was a convicted dastard, those were his words, and that Hammond himself was no longer bound to the code to accept a duel from such a dishonorable man. This bizarre episode shows just how ritualized and central this culture of controlled violence was to the Southern elite. This code of honor was held up by a radical shift in ideology. In the early Republic, many Southerners, including Thomas Jefferson, had described slavery as a necessary evil, a regrettable but unavoidable part of their society. But by the 1830s, under increasing pressure from the growing abolitionist movements in the North, Southern intellectuals began to mount a new defense. They argued that slavery was not actually evil at all, but it was a positive good to the slave. Sounds ridiculous. But a leading proponent of this view was a Virginia writer named George Fitzhugh. In works like Sociology for the South, Fitzhugh launched a blistering attack on the free labor society of the North. He argued that Northern factory workers were in fact slaves themselves. They were wage slaves, and they were far more exploited and insecure. They were in a worse position than the enslaved people in the South. In his view, slavery in the South was benevolent. It was a paternalistic system that protected black people because they were supposedly inferior, and then therefore it ensured social harmony, unlike the chaotic, competitive capitalism of the North. Perhaps no one articulated this new aggressive pro-slavery worldview, with more confidence at least, than whom we just mentioned, James Henry Hammond of South Carolina, the same man from the dueling story. In a famous speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1858, Hammond laid out two theories that would become cornerstones of the pro-slavery argument. The first was his mudsill theory. Hammond argued that all great civilizations required a laboring class to perform the menial tasks, to provide the foundation, or the mudsill, upon which the elite could build progress and culture. He declared, quote, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand, a race inferior to her own. We use them for our purpose and call them slaves." End quote. This theory explicitly naturalized the exploitation of slavery. It rooted it in a racist hierarchy. He claimed that the South's enslaved laborers were happy and well cared for, while the North's white hireling class was miserable and dangerously they had the right to vote. Second, Hammond proclaimed the South's immense economic power, a power derived from its monopoly on the world's most vital commodity. This was his cotton is king argument. With breathtaking arrogance, he threatened the North and the world. Quote, "Without firing a single gun, without drawing a sword, should they make war on us, we could bring the whole world to our feet. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." End quote. These ideals, the honor code, the positive good argument, and the mudsill theory were not separate concepts. They formed a unified ideological system designed to justify and maintain the power of the planter class. The honor code regulated power horizontally among the elites, ensuring that only those who demonstrated mastery were fit to rule. The racial ideology of the mudsill theory justified their power vertically. It justified their power over millions of people which they enslaved. And violence, the pistol in the duel or the whip on the plantation, was the ultimate arbiter in both spheres. It was a closed, self-reinforcing system of belief and brutality. When I said it was a system built on violence, this is what we mean. The enslavers built this world on these ideals of honor, but also on domination. They wrote books, they gave speeches to justify such use of force. But what about the world of the 4 million people that they held in bondage? How did they survive? How did they live? How did they love? How did they fight back? We're going to hear their stories in their own words next. While the planter class was constructing the ideological justifications for slavery, 4 million people that they held as slaves constructed a world all their own. And it was a world built not on abstract theories, but on the lived realities of family and faith, and I cannot stress this enough, of resistance, a constant struggle to affirm their humanity in a system designed to destroy it. The institution of slavery was, in many ways, a war on the black family. The ever-present threat of sale of one's family members meant that spouses could be separated and children torn from their parents at any moment. For enslaved women, the burdens were immense. They faced the triple exploitation of their labor, their reproductive capacity to create more property for their enslaver, and the constant looming threat of sexual violence from their enslavers. The narrative of Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl provides one of the most powerful accounts of this struggle. Writing under the pseudonym Linda Brent, Jacobs details the relentless sexual harassment and violence she endured from her enslaver, Dr. Flint. She writes of his chilling words, quote, "He told me I was his property, that I must be subject to his will in all things. My soul revolted against the mean tyranny, but where could I turn for protection? He peopled my young mind with unclean images, and such as only a vile monster could think of." End quote. She's talking about rape. To escape Flint's predations, Jacob made a desperate choice. She entered into a relationship with another white man named Mr. Sands, with whom she had 2 children. Her goal was not love, but survival, and it was a desperate bid for a measure of control over her own body. She appeals directly to her northern female readers, who could not comprehend her dilemma. Quote, "But O ye happy women whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, who have been free to choose the objects of your affection, do not judge the poor desolate slave girl too severely." End quote. Her ultimate act of maternal devotion was to hide for 7 years in a tiny, cramped attic space, which she called the loophole of retreat, just so that she could remain close to her children and protect them from the fate she so feared. Just as enslaved people fought bitterly to maintain family ties, they also forged their own spiritual lives, and it was separate from the control of those who tried to control it, their enslavers. While these enslavers often forced a version of Christianity upon them, emphasized in passages like, quote, "Servants, obey your masters," the enslaved community created what historians call an invisible institution. In secret gatherings, often deep in the woods in what were known as hush harbors, they created a vibrant and syncretic faith. These services that were secret blended Christian theology with West African traditions, featuring ecstatic worship, call and response singing, dancing, and the creation of Negro spirituals. The message here was one not of obedience, but of liberation. As one formerly enslaved person recalled, the white preacher would say, quote, "Do whatsoever your master tells you to do," end quote. But in the hush harbors, that message was radically different. It was a belief that God would one day free them from slavery. This theology of liberation was a direct spiritual and political challenge to the enslavers' authority. And the spirit of defiance manifested itself in a wide spectrum of resistance. It wasn't limited to dramatic armed rebellions like the one led by Nat Turner in 1831, which some historians believed was planned within the network of these invisible churches. Resistance was a daily practice, and I cannot stress that resistance takes many forms. Enslaved people asserted their agency in countless small but significant ways, feigning illness to reclaim a moment of rest, working slowly to protest their exploitation, breaking tools to disrupt the plantation's workflow, stealing food to supplement the meager rations that they were given. Each of these small acts, they might seem minor in our eyes, but each of them was a blow against the system, a reclamation of their time and their labor, and most importantly, their humanity. In this context, the primary battlefield was often cultural. The slave system's logic demanded the destruction of the black family to facilitate sale and control of religion to ensure their obedience. Therefore, the determined effort of enslaved peoples to create and sustain kinship bonds and to forge a wholly new theology of freedom were not coping mechanisms. They were direct strategic acts of war against an institution that sought to reduce them to isolated, soulless property units of labor. Their most profound resistance was their collective refusal to be dehumanized. How do we make sense of this paradoxical society? For decades, historians have fought over the very soul of the Old South. Was it a pre-capitalist aristocratic world, as one major school of thought had argued? Or was it the cutting edge of a new brutal form of capitalism, as a more recent group of historians now contend? This isn't just semantics. How we answer this question changes how we understand the causes of the Civil War and the very nature of economic development. So, first, let's look at the paternalistic thesis, most famously articulated by the historian Eugene Genovese in his 1974 book, Roll, Jordan, Roll. Genovese argued that the Old South was a unique paternalist society. He contended that the master-slave relationship was not a simple cash nexus, but a complex, negotiated system of reciprocal obligations. That's how he called them, however grotesquely unequal they might be. In this view, the planters saw themselves as patriarchs responsible for the care and guidance of their so-called enslaved family. This self-serving ideology, Genovese argued, nonetheless gave the enslaved a framework they could use to assert their own humanity and demand certain rights. He famously argued that slaves turned paternalism into a, quote, weapon of resistance. By holding masters to their own paternalistic standards, they could carve out a space for themselves. For Genovese and the planters' worldview, it was a fundamentally aristocratic and pre-capitalist, and it was driven by a desire for honor and mastery, not just the bottom line. However, in recent years, a new generation of scholars, often called the new historians of capitalism, has mounted a powerful challenge to this view. Historians like Edward Baptist and Walter Johnson argue that slavery wasn't a backwards obstacle to capitalism. Slavery was capitalism in its most dynamic, violent, and profitable form. Baptist argues that an incredible 400% increase in cotton picking productivity between 1800 and 1860 was not due to new technology, but to a system of calibrated torture that he calls the pushing system. Overseers used the whip not just for punishment, but as a tool of production management, constantly pushing enslaved workers to meet ever higher quotas. Violence itself was a technology, one to maximize output. Johnson focuses on the Mississippi Valley as the epicenter of a global capitalist system. He shows how the enslaved bodies there were not just labor, they were financial assets. They were used as collateral for mortgages and bonds that were traded on national and international markets, fueling economic expansion far beyond the plantations with which they were confined. Baptist drives this point home, arguing that the massive increase in cotton production was due to a, quote, absolutely necessary increase in torture, which was the ultimate cause of the economic boom. So which side is right? Well, the debate is fierce. Critics argue that Genovese's theory can downplay the raw economic brutality of the slave system. The new historians of capitalism, on the other hand, are sometimes criticized for using an overly broad definition of capitalism and for misinterpreting some quantitative data. Perhaps the most useful way to view this debate is not as an either-or question. It's possible that the planters' ideology was paternalistic while their practice was brutally capitalist. They spoke the language of honor-bound patriarchs, as Genovese's work shows, often drawn from their diaries and letters. This was how they justified their world to themselves and to outsiders, but their actions in the global marketplace revealed in the economic data and financial records studied by Baptist and Johnson were those of ruthless profit maximizing capitalists. The paternalistic self-image was the necessary psychological and cultural mask that made the relentless pursuit of capitalist exploitation palatable. It was the cultural software that allowed the brutal hardware of slave capitalism to function. So we'll end here. What was the Cotton Kingdom? Well, it was a modern, global economic powerhouse built on a foundation of violence and torture. It was a society of genteel, honor-bound planters who profited from the systematic rape and destruction of families. It was a land of liberty for some, built on the absolute subjugation of millions. It was, in short, a kingdom of paradox, held together by violence and the immense world-shaping power of a single crop, cotton. But a kingdom built on such rapacious agricultural system, one that, as our textbook notes, drained the soil of nutrients, as well as a brutal labor system that commodified human beings, could not stand still. It had to expand. The Cotton Kingdom was, as Walter Johnson argues, pathologically expansive. It needed more land for cotton, and it needed new territories to extend the reach of slavery. This insatiable hunger for both would soon push America's borders westward, across the plains, over the mountains, all the way to the Pacific. This relentless drive for expansion, for more land for cotton, for more territory for slavery, would soon set the South on a collision course with the rest of the nation and with Mexico. It was a drive that had a name, a belief that it was God's given right for America to expand from sea to shining sea. Next time on Star-Spangled Studies, we will explore this explosive idea, manifest destiny. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.